What does scope leveling and machine maintenance have in common? These are your questions answered today on the shop. Come on in. Well, good day everyone, and welcome back to the shop. Today we're going to be answering your questions. I had a bunch of questions over the past couple videos. I didn't write y'all's names or anything down like that because a lot of them revolved around similar themes, so I just kind of wrote the basics down and we'll go from there. So let's dive in. The first question had to do a lot with equipment maintenance and how I maintain my equipment. I think a lot of that's kind of common sense, but if you're new, I can see where you kind of want to have a game plan. So I come into the shop every day. Whatever machine I'm going to be using that day, I just verify it's clean. I wipe it down, spray it down, wipe everything down, give it a shot of oil if I'm on the lathe or whatever. I'm going to oil my ways. Oil everything that needs to be oiled. Same thing on the mill. I'm going to make sure the head, all its oil cups get oil. On my machine, the bed and knee, it's all a one-shot system, so I just give it a couple pumps and I'm ready to roll. I do my work. I clean the machine off before I shut down for the night. I may not empty the chip pan out in the lathes that day. It just depends on how full it is. But on the mill, I have a shop vac. I clean all those things up. I'm not a big fan of metal splinters, so I like to keep everything pretty clean. One thing I do at the end of every day is, and you don't see this very often, but I spray all of the machine surfaces down with silicone spray. Why do I do that? This, it dissipates moisture, which is really good. So if your shop isn't climate controlled, you're working out in your garage or whatever, you can get flash rust. That eliminates that. And what's really nice is it's a good protective finish that doesn't leave a sticky, oily residue over everything. So my bedways, my compound cross-slide saddle, chucks, everything like that on the lathe gets sprayed down. Same thing on the mill. It just keeps everything running and looking really, really nice. That's every day. Before every precision project, I do check level on the machines. When I moved them in, everything was set up the way I like to set them up. There's a whole video, if you're interested, on truing your lathe for precision work that I did. That's how I set my lathe up. Once you go through that nightmare, it's generally pretty easy unless you move it or you crash it or something like that. Then you got to go through all that. So if I'm doing precision work, before every job I check my level. I check level on everything in the shop once a month. Once a month I try to go through and really just clean everything, like clean the machines. Really kind of, I don't want to say like a deep detail clean, but they get pretty a good healthy cleaning. About 4 times a year I do go through the whole setup on truing my lathe just to make sure everything's true. I do, again, 4 times a year on that. Down here in Texas, it's probably not that big of a deal. It's probably not as big of a deal depending on your foundation. This shop was built really well with the idea of heavy equipment being in it. So the concrete's very robust, the base is very solid. I don't need to do it probably that much, but I do. If you live in sandy soil or up north where you get a good frost bed, you're probably going to want to do that as the seasons change, because it's going to affect the ground. How it moves is going to affect the setup of your equipment. So again, 4 times a year, I go through the chewing process on the lathe and on my mill. The surface grinder, not really a big deal. If that gets out of whack, that tool is designed to fix itself. So 4 times a year on that. Once a year, I go through and I detail clean everything. I mean deep detail clean, strip everything down, and just really get in there and clean the bedways, clean all that oil and anything that gets bedded in there. That takes a little bit, because like on the mill, you're pulling that whole table off and you're getting in there and just cleaning everything. It's a real big deal. Same thing on the lathe. I go through and drain the oil out of the headstock and the gearbox on the lathe. I'm going to be looking at that for anything unusual like metal chips or anything like that. Put the correct oil back into the machine, kind of go through a break-in process with that again, and just make sure everything, the bearings are good and all of that. You pay a lot for these machines. You don't need them to go down. It's costly to fix or replace. On the mill, with the one-shot oil system, I do drain the oil out of that container and just put fresh oil in it, and that's good to go. Again, once a year, the other big thing that I do is just kind of spring cleaning. I go through the whole shop. I'm looking at tools. I'm checking calibration on my indicators and micrometers and things like that. If they need to go out and get calibrated, that gets done. I have duplicates of almost everything, so if I have to send a set out, I still have sets to use. I just go through and clean everything, just like you would or should with your house. Everything just gets like a good spring cleaning. Everything gets cleaned, vacuumed, swept up, whatever. In the machine shop, I like to keep a pretty tidy shop, and that's really about it. So hopefully that answers your question on equipment maintenance. But that silicone spray, that's a big one. I really believe in that 100%. Moving along, I've got kind of a twofold question. Some of it I'm going to answer quickly, and some I'm not. I've got a question on tools and what kind of tools I use, and what are real handy, what are real handy tools. I think the best way to answer that question is to say I'm probably going to do a standalone video on that. And the reason being is that could take a whole hour. There's depending on what you're doing, there's a lot to cover. I've got toolboxes and benches and cabinets and things just chock-a-block full of stuff. It would take a long time to go through that. I'm kind of thinking about doing maybe breaking it down, like tools for the lathe, tools for the mill, tools for general gunsmithing, and specialized tooling for like rifle smithing, stock making, things like that. I think it'd be a lot easier to digest. That being said, the follow-up question to that was about just handy gadgets that make setup and life easier in the shop. And I will answer that. And I'm going to try to see if I can't put links to these down below, because these are fantastic tools that I really believe in, and they're made, they're setup tools for your mill and your lathe. They're exceptional. They're made by a company called Edge Technology, EDGE Technology. The first thing we're going to talk about, And I don't use it that much. And I have a little bit of a different way that I cut tapers nowadays, but before I built my jig, this is what I use. This is a Edge Technologies truing bar. And what's nice about this is these are ground and hardened ends. So you don't have to remake a truing bar every time or go through that process. They're pretty, everything that they make is very budget friendly, I believe. But this goes on centers, and then you can adjust your taper using a dial indicator and just moving it back and forth. And then when you're done with it, you put it in its little case, and that's it. This is a really handy tool if you do a lot of outside turning, really any kind of turning. What I do with the way I set my lathe up is I kind of take a reading of where things are at, and when it's true, I write that down. If I have to use this, I'll calculate my taper, get that set, and then when I need to return it back to its home position, I have those measurements. Like I said, I do that a little bit different now, but when you're first starting out, that's a real handy tool to have to get you going. Again, Edge Technologies. This little guy is probably one of my favorites that they make. And what it is it's a tool post. It sets the height of your tooling, and how this works is you have a hardened ground rod that you can either put in your collet and tighten down, or get it dialed in on a chuck, and then this little lip right here corresponds to the center line of this ground rod, and so you just adjust your tool height until the level shows level, and now your everything is running coaxial to your spindle. Really handy tool. I use this all the time. Back in the old days, if you were going through machine shop or anything like that, you would make a tool height jig, which would go on your saddle, on your cross slide. And usually what you would do is you would take for me, I always used a 1/2-inch piece of ground rod because it was easy math. Half of a half is 250 thousandths, and then I would build basically a barbell. If you got real fancy, you could put a magnetic base to that height, and then you would run your tool up to it until it was, you could run a feeler gauge across the top, and you wouldn't feel that bump. Everything was set to the same height. This is a heck of a lot quicker than that because you're actually looking at a bubble level. I love that tool. Really, really handy tool. The next, and this is probably my favorite, especially if you do a lot of work on the mill, and all of these you can kind of make. They're not too terrible, and like I said, back in the old days, that's what you did. Like if you do any kind of real milling on your mill, you have a tram and a nod, and when you're cutting different angles or different shapes, you're going to have to calculate all that and set the machine up, and then it's always kind of a chore to get everything square again and plumb. Back in the day, what I did is I made a jig that it'd clamp on the spindle, and it was basically a bar that came out with an indicator, and you could sweep the table until everything lined up. I always thought about building one of these. Somewhere in the process of moving the one I had made, it got lost or chunked or whatever, so I ended up getting this deal, and I absolutely love it. This is the Edge Technologies Pro Tram system, and the way that works is it just goes either in a collet or in a chuck on your mill. You have a standard that you'll set on the bed of your mill to 0 each of the indicators. These are 1,000th indicators. And then you can just set your tram left and right until your table's flat. You can run it all the way across the bed, make sure everything's cool, rotate it 180 degrees, and you can set the nod. This works absolutely fantastic. By far, this is my favorite little gadget that I have, and it really helps out in getting that mill set up. I had a lot of questions on schools, gunsmithing schools and things like that, as well as books. And, a lot of those revolved around, do you have any updates? Do you still recommend the same things? And so on and so forth. And for the most part, I in retrospect, I still believe what I believe, but I think the best way to answer those questions is in standalone videos, because those are going to take up some time. The other question I had, it wasn't really a question as much as, hey, you should do a shop tour. We'd like to see the new shop. I'm not really there yet. The machine shop is functional. I've got it set up the way I believe I want it. But I've still got a bunch of things that I need to do. For example, where the Grizzly lathe is, I know that's going to be upgraded at some point to a heavier 3-phase machine. So I just ran, future-proofing a little bit. Just finished running that 3-phase line so that when I get ready to do that, it's all set. I've still got to run an air line in here, in the ceiling, and then insulate the ceiling and get that closed in, and hang lights on the other side of the shop, in the machine shop. Well, I only have half of it lit up. And then I've got all the stuff that I just don't like the most, which is the mudding and the taping of the drywall and the painting. So as far as the machine shop goes, still a little bit out. I've still got to deal with the retail area and kind of figure out how I'm going to do the paint booth area. But it's very functional, just not ready for that kind of tour. Out in the main shop, that's been cleaned up. About all I've got left to do out there really is run my lights and get the bay doors hooked up. Those are all on remotes. They're not a manual door. And then once I get most of that done, I'll do a shop tour, because people like ideas. So when you're starting out, you like to look at a lot of different things. So we will do that. I'll do that when things get a little bit more evolved. It's plenty usable right now, but it's not quite there for shop tour level. One other question I had was actually on the Grizzly, and how I liked it. And I'll probably do kind of an in-depth review of that. I've had that machine now for 3-4 years. I've used the heck out of it. And basically, to answer your question, I have the G0824. That's the big 14. That's their the bigger of the 1440s. It's their 1440 gunsmith lathe with the slightly larger than 2-inch spindle bore, and it comes equipped with the DRO. When I first got that lathe, I didn't know how much I was going to like that DRO. On most of my machines, they're an older machine, so you're either calculating it, or I'm a big fan of the Travadial, like what was on my Clausing. That being said, that DRO works very well. It's plenty accurate for everything I've done with it, and as a whole, I really like the machine. The big thing that drives me absolutely bonkers, but again, it's because it's set up more for gunsmithing, I believe. So you have the narrower headstock, so you're missing basically a whole gear set in there, is changing gears. That drives me bananas, because it's just something else you have to think about. So for example, I'm looking at the machine now, 16, 18, 24, and 28 threads, 26 threads, they're all different. So what I get in the habit of doing is, like, I've got fixing on building a 7 SAUM. The last job I did on this machine was I had to thread a bunch of barrels for muzzle brakes for different people. And so that'll be the first operation I do when I set this barrel up, because it's already set up for a 5/8 thread muzzle device. So I tried it. That's how I try to do that. So whatever I ended last on my last job is the first operation on the new job. And then so I'll do the muzzle threading and all of that, turn it around, get it dialed in and set up for cutting the tenon and doing all those things, or action chewing, or whatever I'm doing. That's about the only thing I don't like about that machine. It's been a really good machine. Of course, I spent the money on that Bison Set True Chuck, which I absolutely love. You know, nothing, you can't, there's no money wasted on good tooling. But outside of that, I'll probably just do a whole standalone video in a more serious review of that lathe. It's a good lathe for the money. So the next question I got involved scope leveling. And there was quite a few questions on this, and I believe that's because we're you know, these started rolling in right at the beginning of hunting season. We're in the middle of hunting season, and then there was like 3 or 4 of you that referenced a pretty popular creator. Most of his content revolves around hunting and reviews and things like that. And it's funny because I watched the same video, and he had made the comment about he had just leveled that scope, but when he looks through it, it always feels like it's canted. Now, as far as that guy goes, I think he's pretty crafty at getting people to engage in the comments, because I think he shoots very well. I think he does some competition. I don't really know that much about the fella, but he seems pretty knowledgeable in what he does. So I believe in his case, that's what's going on. But what it did is it created a dialogue where I had like 3 or 4 of you ask, what causes that? Because it's not just us. My buddy's gun does the same thing. And then this guy on his YouTube channel, it does the same thing. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and the idea of what I call scope leveling versus leveling your crosshairs, because they're 2 very different things. And I'm going to go through this kind of in a very general way, and I imagine at some point I'll do a standalone video on how to actually set this up, or the way I set it up. So what you see a lot of people do is they get their rings or mount on the rifle, they set their eye relief, you know, they lay the scope in it, they put the caps on it, they get it snugged up to where they can still adjust things back and forth. However, you know, it's firm, but you can still move things around fairly easily. They set their eye relief, and then a lot of people, I'm going to go back to that in a minute, so we're going to set that right there. A lot of people will go to a jig like this. This is a short action custom scope leveling kit, And once you get your eye relief set and your rings or mounts, you can attach that to this Picatinny rail. You can either put this in a Arcalock rail, like I have their modular bench vise kit, so that has an Arca plate that everything slides in. Most of the time this goes in a bench vise, and then I take a machinist level. This is on a three-point axis to where I can level the unit, and then you lay your scope in there and you can level your scope. And how I see a lot of people do it, and there's some pretty good rifle smiths out there that do it this way, is they'll find either a flat, they'll either use the flat on their cap or the flat on the bottom of the scope and a parallel bar or something like that, and they'll set it in there and they'll level the lathe, or level the scope, and then cinch everything down. Okay, so that's great, but then you go to actually present the rifle, and you look through the scope, and you say, wow, those don't look level. What's going on there is these aren't guaranteed true to the crosshairs. So I don't level scopes personally, I level the crosshairs. And my process is pretty much the same. There's two ways that I do it. We can either set it up in the rifle where you would come in, we'd set everything up on the bench, you would shoulder the rifle, look through it, and we make all those adjustments while you're here. If you're not able to come in and do it that way, what I do is it goes in the Short Action Custom jig, and then what I have is this shop is 60 feet, so 50 feet, or 40, 50 feet at the other end of the shop. I set up a plumb bob, and I'll set this, get this leveled, set the scope on there, look through the scope, and align the crosshairs to that the string on the plumb bob. That is how you should be leveling your scope, in my opinion. You're not really worried about the scope level, you're worried about your crosshairs being true. If you're really shooting distance, I recommend 50 to 100 yards. I think the further, 100 yards is plenty good to make sure that those crosshairs are perfect. The other thing briefly that I'll talk about is I'm a big fan of scope levels. So this is a very fine mount, scope mount. This is a spur mount. It's the SP 4001. And one thing I like about this mount, I don't know if you probably won't be able to see it, but in the back of the mount at the bottom, there is a bubble level. I don't look at that too much anymore. Over a period of time, you learn through position and glancing at that where level is, and it'll kind of get ingrained in your mind. If your mount doesn't have a level in it, or your rail doesn't have a level in it, I highly recommend a scope level in some form of fashion. That way you can double check. That's going to save you a lot of aggravation no matter how you do things. But the biggest takeaway is don't level the scope, true up the actual crosshairs. And that will be that can take some time, and I'll do that'll be down the road. I'll do a whole separate video on leveling scopes and crosshairs for accuracy, because that's very important. All right, so our final topic for the day is probably the most time consuming. That's why I've saved it till last, but it's also the one I get asked about the most. And that has to do with accurizing, blueprinting, building a custom rifle, however you want to say it. And what the question is if you're building a rifle, what are the three most important things that you look at? It's fairly simple. It's the lock, it's the old adage, lock, stock, and barrel. The lock is the action, of course, the barrel's the barrel. And then I'm not really going to say stock anymore. We're going to say foundation, because you have stocks and you have chassis and all kinds of different things. So we're just going to say foundation. Out of those three things, the most important aspect of that for me is that barrel. If you have a barrel that just by itself it shoots a 3/4 inch MOA or half MOA, that's what that barrel is. It's not going to be any better than that. You can do things to squeeze a little bit more out of it, like load development, maybe put a tuner on it, things like that. But at the end of the day, that shoots what it shoots. So I'm going to focus on really, really high quality barrels. I think that is money very well spent. From there, we're going to look at the action, be it a custom action or blueprint, a factory action, in the processes involved in that. And then finally, we need to look at the foundation that everything's going to sit in. Once you've dealt with those three things, if you've done your part right in looking after those components, you have the foundation for a very accurate system. Everything else, load development, triggers, scopes, mounts, all of those things, your bolt tuning, however you want to call it, all of that, you're dealing in the minutia. You're dealing in the very fine points of just wringing an already accurate system for every ounce of accuracy out of it. And that's how I look at it. As far as selling it to or presenting it to a customer, I don't like to sell. I don't approach people that way. I present information. We have a conversation. And usually the question I get about that is, how do you know where to draw the line? How do you know where you're gonna, how do you sell that or present that information to your customer? Well, I've already established categorically the most important aspects of accuracy that I feel we need to deal with. And that's how we start that process, is with a conversation. What is your intended purpose? And what is your budget? And if they say, well, this is what I want to do, I really don't know, then the way I present it is I know because of the barrels that I use and the actions I use, or if we're blueprinting an action, I've done it enough where I have, like, I know the cost of that in my brain. I've put together labor packages for each step. So your barrel work is X amount of dollars, your action work is X amount of dollars, your whatever we're doing to the foundation is X amount of dollars. And typically that's, it usually runs high. So that way when they get the it's an estimate, and I always like to kind of come in lower than what we talk about. I really am a big believer in exceeding expectation. But that's kind of how I do it. We'll start with the barrel. I'll talk about how the process that I use to chamber that barrel and do that work. And then we talk about actions, be it a custom action. If that's out of their budget, We talk about blueprinting, working with what they have, and that's a set price, and it doesn't matter to me what it is. If it's a Remington action, there's things that are standard. We're going to upgrade the recoil lug. We're going to go through the fire control system. We're going to true the action. If it's a Ruger American or something like that that uses a barrel nut, 9 times out of 10, we're going to get rid of that barrel nut, and we're going to make a much more rigid system. That's included in that price. When we get to the foundation aspect, i.e. the stock, the price that I quote includes inletting, bedding, pillar bedding, or basically what I would, better way to say it is all your inletting, pillar bedding, and bedding of the action, setting up your rails or mounts, and then if you need me to, we do the scope. You can always come down on that pricing as you go along, but I like to hit so we kind of know where we're working. So if something comes along and we're in between point A and point D, I have wiggle room, because not every foundation is going to need to be pillar bedded or bedded. You know, you may, if it's a chassis, you may only need to skim bed it. You may not even need to do that. So you're just doing a final assembly. But the price I give is a package price, and then I can work my way down. But basically, I walk them through each step of the process and what they can expect to get, and that way there's no surprises, and there's enough kind of wiggle room built in there to where if something does come up unexpected, we can absorb that and it won't be over budget. Typically, I find if you focus on those 3 things kind of in that order, you know, this is the best bang for your buck kind of process. The idea of trying to sell the work, you don't really need to worry about it, because the process kind of speaks for itself, and it really kind of sells itself. I'm going to keep, there's a lot to this. I'm going to keep it very short and very sweet in this, because we're getting ready to do a whole video on exactly this process from start to finish, in the processes that I use to blueprint rifles. So anyway, that'll about wrap it up for today. I hope that answered your questions. Keep them coming. We'll try to do this on a regular basis. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully you found value in the video. And if you did, please remember to like and subscribe. That's all, guys. Till next time. Thanks.